Yeah, just before we get started, my name is Liz Zito, and I am an administrator at MFA Photography, Video, and Related Media. And this event tonight is part of our Scheimpflug lecture series, Investigations in the Lens and Screen, with our wonderful longtime faculty member, Lyle Rexer, who teaches in our department and BFA photo. And is that it? Is there any more in there?
Yeah, I teach actually, of all things, in the fashion program, in the MPS fashion program.
Fashion. And I'll hand it over to you to introduce and
our distinguished guests.
Yes, our distinguished guests.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I really appreciate that. We have a couple of things to do tonight that I think are important. One is, and certainly the most important, was I want to inaugurate, or I want to introduce to our audience the new series of books that's being launched by the School of Visual Arts. It's been a long time in the birthing. The first title in that series, and we'll talk more about the series in a minute, the first title in the series is a book that I wrote called The Critical Eye, 15 Pictures to Understand Photography. And if you believe that, I have some waterfront property in Kansas you might be interested in. Also a bridge in Brooklyn you might want to buy. That was the first book in the series, and it was always conceived of as a series. That series is a collaboration between the School of Visual Arts, the MFA Department of Film, Video, and Photography, and Intellect Press in England. Intellect Press is a very interesting and very ambitious publisher. They sit in a I think a very compelling space in the academic world. They're distributed by University of Chicago in this country. In England, their reputation is going up, is how I would put it. I was just looking at a book, as a matter of fact, that I'm probably going to review, that they've just published. And I think it's the kind of book that I'd very much like us to be associated with. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we've really got several things to do. One is I'll talk a little bit about my book. And then I want to move into the series. And to help me do that, I have three people with me tonight who I think will provide, I think, some really, really interesting perspectives on all this. The first is Robert Bowen, who's a faculty member in our department, the MFA program. He's a New York-based artist. He works in various formats, including video. I'm going to read this, by the way, so it sounds a little artificial, but at least I'll get it all in. Photo exhibitions, installations, architecture, stereoscopic media, site-specific visualization, and performance. His work's been seen in a lot of different places. We've seen it certainly in lectures here at the School of Visual Arts, at the New York Public Library, at Yale, the Idea Journal, Skyscraper Museum Studio in Nice, and a number of other places. He's worked with Cabinet Magazine, for example. And he said, as Bob was saying, much of his work takes the form of diachronic montage, synthesizing different time periods to reference the present. And he teaches both in the graduate and the undergraduate programs at the School of Visual Arts. We'll talk a little bit more about the project that Bob's working on later in the evening. It's a fascinating project, and I think characteristic, I would say, of what I would hope, and I think Charlie Traub, who was the inaugurator of this series, is very much on board with. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Our second interlocutor, let's say, is Keren Moskovic, who teaches with me in the BFA program. She is, and she also teaches in the art history program. She's an alum of the MFA program, and she's a multimedia artist and scholar who's working in collaboration, scholarship, and practice-based research. Her film, One More Way to Sink Into My Heart, celebrated its world premiere in 2019 in Sydney, Australia, at the Sydney World Film Festival, where it won Best Documentary Feature. She's currently writing a book. We're going to hear a little bit more about this project on radical intimacy in contemporary art. It's actually, that's a sort of anodyne description of what's actually quite a provocative topic. We're going to hear more about that. And finally, Yasi Alipoor. who she got her BFA from SVA in 2016. Is that right, Yasi? Okay. And her MFA from Columbia in 2018. She's now on the BFA faculty at SVA. She's, as I said, she's a resident at she is a resident in the Sharp Walentis Studio program, which is where she's coming from tonight. She's a frequent contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. So, she's a terrific artist. And I wanted to have another chance to talk to her a little bit about her current projects. She brings, I think, an important perspective to this, and I've talked a little bit about that. I think we'll talk about that. Yasi is a member of our board of advisors for the series. So before I go into that, I've got some people I do need to thank to get us get us going. First of all, I need to thank SVA first and foremost. SVA has become a sponsor for this series with Intellect Press. Obviously, it couldn't happen without SVA sponsorship. And at very crucial moments, they've been enormously helpful. They have, for example, provided sabbatical funds for me to be able to finish writing the book, which was absolutely essential. And through the SVA Foundation, they did something else that was a kind of a game changer. That was the SVA Foundation is a 501c3, so they can function as an umbrella when you deal with granting agencies in a way that the school itself cannot. And as a result of that, I was able to get a grant from the J.M. Kaplan Fund through a program called Furthermore. And I want to point this out because I think it's tremendously important. The Furthermore program of the Kaplan Fund does one simple thing. It supports publication. And what that meant in my case was it gave me funds to secure publication rights for the photographs. And I don't have to tell anybody who is in the academic world about the challenge and the increasing challenge of securing photo rights to even the most academic publication. Costs are going up for a variety of reasons. And without that kind of support, it becomes virtually impossible to do the full-scale presentation that any decent or any conscientious academic discussion requires. So I want to make a special point of thanking the Kaplan Fund. Then there are some other people, the editors at Intellect Press, who put up a lot of problems for me. Yelena Stanovnik is the most important. Charlie Traub, who actually recruited me into this process in the first place. My wife, Rachel Klein, who actually ripped me a new one when she read the manuscript, and Steele Stillman, who's on the faculty here in the MFA program, who also ripped me a new one when he read the manuscript. Yasi Alipoor, who's one of our people tonight, who read the manuscript and also ripped me a new one. Stephen Fraley, who is formerly the head of the BFA program, who was very supportive of my work. And finally, Abby Robinson, who also read the manuscript. These are all people who had a lot to say about what they read. They really altogether changed the direction of the manuscript and actually made it possible. And I'll talk about that process a little bit in a minute because anyone who gets involved in the process of academic publishing should know exactly what they're getting in for. And that process is, it's not always pleasant, it's very instructive, but it can be fraught if you're coming from outside a traditional academic milieu, which is where I am. I don't have a PhD. I'm connected with an institution that, although it is an academic institution, we do teach, and we are a very good teaching institution. Our structures are not based on publication. They're not based on peer review, and they are not based on the kind of publish or perish mentality that you see in academia. And as a result of that, getting into the club and publishing with an academic publisher is not easy. You have to pass a kind of peer review process, and that, as I said before, can be eye-opening. So it requires a lot of people, I think, to back you up, to give you outside perspective and to help you think through things that otherwise you can do what I did, which is you can make some mistakes. The other group, and I hate to prolong this, I want to thank my board of advisors. And we were talking about this earlier. It's really important, I think, for a series like this to have a board of advisors, outsiders, who can serve in a number of functions. They can maybe when necessary, they can review manuscripts or ideas for manuscripts or even proposals, just to see if there are areas of specialization where they can contribute. They can also provide context to people who might be thinking in the same areas and who we might consider recruiting to write about these, to write about new topics. And just in general, their presence, of course, gives the series a little clout and a little more weight. So the people are, as at this moment on our board of advisors, are David Campany, who's the director of programs at the International Center for Photography, Dragan Espenshid, who is a digital artist and a composer, and he's the head of digital preservation for Rhizome in New York City. He works a lot with the new museum. Jose Luis Falcone, who's with us tonight, who is a lecturer in fine arts at Brandeis University and a kind of an intellectual force of nature. Yasi Alipoor, who I introduced earlier, the visual artist, faculty member, and let's call her political conscience. Tom Hune, who's the chair of art history at SVA and chair of visual and critical studies in the School of Visual Arts. And Bo Wang, who is a graduate of this program, is a very successful filmmaker who is now in Amsterdam studying for his PhD. And finally, Joanna Zelinska, who's a professor of new media at Goldsmiths College in the University of London. She's the author of a book called Non-Human Photography, which is, I think we may talk a little bit more about that whole universe of ideas. But it's a really interesting board. They bring a bunch of different perspectives to this, and I'm really excited that they all agreed to do this. The one final thing I want to say about the series, at least for now, is this. The original idea of the series, and I think this is really important, was as a vehicle or a platform for the kind of community of SVA to make new work, that is new intellectual work. It's not a platform for individual artists to publish monographs. It's not a platform for more occasional kinds of publications. It's very much about organizing a set of themes and doing what I think are important projects around those ideas. And I had some models in mind, I think we all do, but there were a number of series that really have formed my idea about, what a series ought to do. And I think the main thing is to create texts that people go back to again and again because they become foundational, whatever reason. And a number of those series that have been really important to me, I just want to mention a few. One is an old series of books the Harpers did called States and Revolutions. You should look up this series. It was done in paperback. It's starting in the 70s. And it was a tremendously important series of books. Politically really important for their time. The other one is a series, it was a couple of series done by MIT. One is a Leonardo series, which I think many of you will know. And that really has been a revolutionary series of book publishing, kind of bringing in ideas of new media and technology into the mix. MIT's series with Jürgen Habermas of his writings and writings around his ideas of communication theory also been tremendously influential. And again, I mention these because I think of these as foundational texts. I think of these things as books that we want to go back to, want to have in our libraries and we go back to. And when I talked to David Rhodes about establishing this series, he was very clear about that. SVA has done series in the past that have been very good. Most important with Allworth Press about 15 years ago, I think that's when they started. That's a terrific series of books and super important. And if we can achieve that level, but with even wider readership, we have the potential to do that. I think we'll be successful. So anyway, that's kind of background. What I wanted to do now, if we can just kind of switch gears for a minute, I did want to talk a little bit about the genesis of my book in particular. It was the first book in the series. It was chosen from a number of proposals that were submitted by MFA faculty. And it was thought to be, the kind of book that might become that sort of text that people refer to. And it's based on teaching that I did in the BFA program. But it also had some other origins. And I have 6 or 7 slides that I just want to look at quickly to give us a sense of sort of like where this project, what this project is, where it came from, why I think it fits into the series. So I want to share my screen, if that's okay. Am I clear to do that, Liz? I'm clear to do that, right? You're gonna have to do that through your,
Yeah, let me know if there's any problems. I think you should be fine.
okay. All right, I'm just gonna show you just 6 or 7 slides, give you kind of the lay of the land about what I was thinking about, how the series actually got off the ground for me. Right. Let's go back here. Can you see that? I just want to make sure everybody can see this, this image. Okay, this is the cover of the book. Is that visible to all?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, good. All right. So there were a number of things that I was experiencing while I was teaching and writing and thinking about photography over the last 20 years that, in a way, what I was really attempting to do was kind of like bring these things together and start to think about them in a more organized way. And I'd written a number of books about photography already that dealt with some marginal sort of or semi-marginal topics. And what it felt like to me was a lot of these topics were actually starting to come together in interesting ways. I was seeing things that in my various travels that were both puzzling and intriguing to me. One was a series of images by a woman from Argentina who passed away just about a year and a half ago, Graciela Sacco, who was a good friend. She was appropriating images and they were moving. That is, she was putting them on things and they were showing up in a lot of different installations and in different places. So I was really intrigued with this idea of not just the appropriation, but the idea that the image would be kind of itinerant or mobile. And it would show up in different places, on suitcases, on walls, on doorways, both the political aspect of that and also just the kind of physical aspect of a photograph that kind of like shows up in different places, has different work to do when it shows up, and appears on different supports. All that was intriguing to me. And I wanted to, that was kind of in the back of my mind about how that might be a part of what I was going to write about. The one that galvanized me is probably this image by Myung-Ho Lee. And it serves as a kind of the opening image for the entire book. And it helped me begin to kind of theorize, at least in a kind of clumsy way, the kind of the totality of photography, or at least give me a way into talking about it. And what I was intrigued by, of course, was the fact that this reference he makes, and this is from a series Myung-Ho Lee did in the 2000s. And it's kind of a one-note idea. That is, it's done a whole series of pictures of trees with backdrops established behind them. I was interested in many things about this. The reference to 19th century photography, which is not something Myung-Ho Lee was particularly interested in, but it certainly interested me. The notion of taking what's essentially a kind of natural seeing that we often attribute to photography and kind of like basically wrenching us out of that illusion by putting a backdrop behind this to indicate how artificial the image is. That absolutely struck a chord. And it seems to me emblematic, really, of where photography has gone, or where it is. I mean, I often tell my students that there's no such thing as dumb photography anymore. But at least in kind of artistic terms, what I was interested in was how photographers have come to theorize, you might say, every aspect of their practice. So what's on the table is everything that cannot be taken for granted in the photograph. And I was absolutely excited by that idea. I've been intrigued for a long time about aspects of photography that simply have been assumed and need to be taken apart. And that's what I saw photographers doing over and over again in really, really important ways. Again, Myung-Ho Lee's picture simply laid that on the table and made it obvious. And I was seeing a lot of work that was being done in alternative media that had been resurrected. This is Jerry Spagnoli's Daguerreotype of the Millennium celebration in Times Square. And that actually is an image that I've come back to, and a number like it by other artists who are working in what are now explicitly antiquarian media, anything from black and white film to, to gum printing. And what I was thinking about, and what I have been thinking about for the series, is this relationship that's shifted in photography between, you might say, the present and the past. And one of my ideas for the series, and something Charlie and I have talked a lot about, is, and that I see in the work that we will talk about a little bit more tonight, is I see the contemporary artist being that crucial lens for rethinking the history of media and the history of photography. That so much of the motive force for reinterpretation of that past, which is ongoing everywhere in the visual arts, is coming from artists themselves. And I've been instructed is too mild a word. I think my life has been completely changed by working with artists and watching them think through what the past, or what the history of photography and what the history of images might be, because obviously that history changes every time a new thing is made. And that constant reevaluation, that constant, let's call it a remaking of history, of a past, means that we are in a time when many things are unsettled. And to me, that's the most exciting thing about the visual arts right now, that the past is completely open in ways that it hasn't been for quite a while. There were some other things that went along with this that I was seeing that were, again, that were challenging to me. This is a picture by Roland Fisher, and it's from a series he did called Pool Portraits. And what I was thinking about this was, after I've been teaching portraiture for a number of years, I began to think of Roland Fisher's picture as a kind of terminus ad quem for the portrait. That is, the very idea that when we look at a picture of someone else, we're actually seeing someone else. And that seems like a simplistic idea. It seems like something that photographers have known has been a kind of illusion for a long time. But it is a persistent illusion that comes up over and over again. And there are reasons why, obviously political reasons, why that documentary notion of the photographic portrait is both useful and problematic. And Roland Fisher was one of those people who simply foregrounded that. He also did a series on monks and nuns that he printed very large, and raised some interesting questions about what does it mean to have a life history. So these kinds of things are obviously kind of coming together, all these questions, and maybe ones that are in some ways closest to my intellectual life, or at least where I am right now, and actually probably got me the most motivated to move the project forward, were a number of photographers were basically taking pictures of nothing. And nothing obviously has as many connotations, but one of the most intriguing nothings were photographers who were working in what's a conventional documentary mode and finding out what its limits are. That is, they went to use a documentary tradition of photography to try to investigate history. And what they found over and over again was that the photograph was inadequate to convey the kinds of information that they were seeking. This is by a South African photographer named Jo Ratcliffe, who's a particular favorite of mine. She did a project where there was an unacknowledged war fought by the South African army in Angola for, they must have been there for 15 or 20 years, very much like their Vietnam, I would say. And after the revolution was completed in Angola, she decided that she was going to come to terms with that aspect of her own growing up. And so she did a project where she went back into Angola through the routes that the soldiers would have taken from South Africa, and she was looking for traces. And what she found was things like this, pictures like this, which is occupied territory, but it's not occupied by anything. So that the resonance of that was tremendously, and has been tremendously important to me, and kind of motivated me to say, look, we really need to bring some of these themes together in one place. I wasn't seeing anything that was written about, photography of nothing. I wasn't seeing anything about a lot of particular projects about various topics, certainly, and really, really intriguing things. But trying to make some sense of all these things together. And just a couple more pictures. In the MFA program, this is by Julian Nash, I was also seeing pictures that I literally could not see. And this was, you might call it this the perceptual aspect, but it's clearly much more, the ramifications are much larger. This is a complicated construction that Julian Nash made of her grandmother's funeral flowers. And it's put together in a variety of ways from many pictures she shot of the same bouquet that were interrupted, shall we say, by certain glitches, programming glitches that she deliberately introduced. I'm probably not doing her process justice, but the programs themselves made the picture, or attempted to make the picture, and to make pictures which were that could be parsed. But what came out of that process was something that we can recognize, but we can't, in a sense, create a gestalt of. And when I saw the large print of this, it was really terrifying to me for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think if you think about a picture like this and what it can do to you when you essentially are immersed in it and you're attempting to parse it, you can kind of understand why this was a sort of challenge and continues to be a challenge in terms of sort of what photography is supposed to do and what we expect of it. And I was thinking about the crisis in documentary photography in terms of photojournalism and the withering critiques that have been launched, and the you might call the contradictions of documentary image making, and the end runs that artists are trying to do around that, and there are many. This is the most dramatic. This is Bloomberg and Channeran attempting to make a documentary image of the Afghan war, which they don't shoot images at all. They just take photo paper and expose it to the conditions of the field. Again, is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? What's really relevant to me is that it's an important idea, because it opens doors on problems and, you might say, contradictions in the way photographs are used, and more important, in what we expect of them. So, and last but not, I'm sorry, I have two more. One is, this was also done by our MFA faculty member, Penelope Imbrico. She was taking classic photographs of the landscape and subjecting them to a variety of filters and distortions through iPhone filters. Thinking about the image environment in which we often encounter the natural world. This too has been a project that's been very important to me in sort of like rethinking what landscape photography is, what it was, and how we, in a sense, have sort of continued to make landscape photographs in contradiction of everything we know about what photographs can actually do for us, at least in terms of sort of their ability to convey information about the situation of the land. Some of these topics, Bob Bowen has got a great deal to say in his, as we'll see in his work. And finally, my undergraduate students were making a lot of cliched pictures. And these were pictures that are essentially kind of like, that grew up in the Instagram generation, you might say. Those are the kind of like white middle class exchangeable images that are almost but not quite cliches, or let's say they begin as cliches, but they're simply remade. And that lack of concern for originality, the lack of concern for whether a picture is actually good or not, obviously put me in mind of the reality that, in fact, we have many uses for pictures. Now, this is obviously it's much more ambitious than the way I've described it. But even the ambition of a picture like this and the kind of smartness of it is cloaked in a certain disposability. Obviously, that's a product of exchange of pictures over social media platforms. But my question behind that is, do we really understand very well what those exchanges are actually all about? I think we're beginning to, but I don't think the descriptions have been adequate. And again, this was something that the people who were around me were instructing me in. and one of the things that this book is motivated by is the fact that there have been a lot of people around me whose work I've been looking at, and they've really been a kind of the motivation for thinking about a lot of this stuff. They've been students, they've been faculty members, they've been colleagues, and that kind of spirit is really what I think the series has to build. That since there's an intellectual community, and that community is dealing with some important topics. Okay, so that's basically where this all got started. When I sat down to write it, it took a whole lot, much longer than I ever thought it would. Thought I knew what I was talking about. I submitted a manuscript. The initial readers' reports were scathing. I tried to do something which I wrote a book with no footnotes. That was absolutely a terrible mistake, and I paid for that. And at one point, I had to decide whether I was going to go back and rewrite this whole book, and I did. I cared enough about the topic. I certainly cared enough about this series to do it. It was a painful process, but it absolutely was essential. So that's always in an academic review process. That's always I think that's the what's the word? That's the break that you face. In other words, you always have to get it through a review process, and that review process, as conducted by Intellect, was, I thought, a really good one. But you have to be ready for it. One has to be ready for it, and that's part of I think part of the process. It's why it takes a long time. And I have experienced pretty much all the problems that you can experience with writing a book like this, and as a result of that, I think I can make life easier, at least as the series editor. I hope I can make life easier as this process goes forward. So anyway, that's kind of a presentation of sort of what that first piece was all about. I wanted the book to be a kind of a teaching book, not a book that you have to read from cover to cover, but one where you can kind of pick the chapters that you're most interested in. Each one is a kind of individual discussion. They're usually based around a single image, and that image is nested in a bunch of others, and the book proceeds thematically, right? So that's it. And I don't know if some in the audience have read it. I'm trying to get my students to read it. If there's any questions or comments about it, I know some of you have read it. I'm not here to solicit, certainly not to solicit praise or anything like that, but I am interested in responses. And I've gotten some really good ones. People, anywhere from Sally Mann to James Welling, to a lot of people have taken a look at it. And there's been some really good feedback so far. So if there's any questions or thoughts early on, I'd love to hear anything that people have to say. If not, that's fine too.
I do have one question. Actually, I think I missed the name of the photograph that it says the terreno ocupado, and I would love to know who is the artist, if you could repeat. Right.
That artist is named, her name is, wait a minute. Her name is Joanne Ratcliffe, Ractlife.
Awesome.
First name Joe, J-O.
Oh, okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, she's really terrific. Anything else that I can enlighten or? Okay.
Lyle, I kind of have a question that maybe is a thought or maybe a comment, but hopefully we'll see. Yeah, I was thinking about the process of the book. Right. And for me, it's been interesting as someone who had like different intimate relationships to the book, as like a student that did not take that class, but was in relationship to that class, as someone who TA'd that class, as someone who helped with research the book in its very early stages. And that was before 2000, that was 2015.
Yes.
It was interesting because I remember in our early conversations, something that has, for me, been always very intriguing about this, your approach to photography and your questions in that moment was the idea of context and the complexity of context in relation to images. of course, being a foreigner, I tend to think about language and translation in similar ways. But then I went to grad school and I came back and the book was getting ready to be finished. And 2018 was a very different time. Socially, politically was a very different time. But also that's the moment where I started teaching and the classroom was very different. And I've only known the US educational system since like 2011, which is like when I started studying here. And the classrooms were diverse. Sure, there were international students, there were different perspectives, but as you've shown with Corey's work, a lot of the work was around this white middle class experience.
Yeah. What you call it, I think the right, the new hegemonic, right?
Sure, yeah, or boredom. It's funny that you called me like the political consciousness of this. And I was like, 2020, you're gonna make the Iranian the political conscious, like no pressure.
Yeah.
Now I get it.
Yeah.
But something I wanted to ask is, then I saw you go through the process of it, like how those 15 images changed.
Oh, absolutely.
How the questions became more complicated, but also suddenly it feels like this question of our relationship with history, like from the weird fetishes for like post-history to like, oh, we just have different histories. We're living in the moment where it's like these narratives of history have a lot of connotation, especially in relationship to images, whether it's social media or historic. Can you tell, like, I'm curious to know about how the idea of extending this invitation as part of this book began, and because it feels important to where we are.
Extending it in what sense? Clarify a little bit.
To have the series. This idea of having proposals to think through other people thinking through this.
Well, you know, it came up. It was always from minute one. It was always conceived, certainly by Intellect and definitely by Charlie, as a relationship in which there would be an ongoing outlet for faculty projects, and not just the sort of standard academic projects. It's not what Intellect really wants. That's not the space they operate in. They're not they're actually not University of Chicago. I think where they sit is probably closer to a publisher like Reaction Books in England. That's kind of their mirror. I think that they have a little bit more intellectually ambitious a program, but it's just my opinion. But it was always conceived as a series, and it became very important as the ideas for the series evolved to really open up the kinds of things that we might talk about, or that a series might deal with in terms of thematically, but always, to me, always anchored in a discussion of sort of present and past. That is a reconsideration of the history of the medium. I mean, that's always been my commitment, or that's always been my sense of what the series ought to do. However that's done thematically. And I'm going to talk about that as I'm just about to introduce the three of you. Each of you will take some time and give a little presentation about what you've been thinking about. Each one of you has got a kind of historical obsession coming out of your work as contemporary artists and contemporary theorists. You know, there is a kind of a need to go back and rethink or understand again those events that have been obviously really important personally and important kind of in the history of your media, but to understand them in a way that I can identify with, which is to absolutely reinvent them from the ground up. Don't take for granted any aspect of that discussion. And one of the things that was, I think, that clarified for me in all this is there's always a danger in trying to reinvent the wheel. Okay, it's like the danger of the autodidact, or the danger of the marginal thinker or the self-taught person. However, if you're not willing to do that, you will accept formulations that are simply not true, not accurate, and certainly not compelling. And if I were going to do this book again, it would be even less committed to kind of conventional ideas about everything from photography to, you know, like human life. And I think that that's our responsibility. It is to go back and rethink all these categories, all these experiences, and certainly our relationship to them. So at the end of the day, what we want is I want readers to go to a book and say, whatever it did, whether it's, everything is like every T is crossed or every I is dotted, it has changed the way I look at what I thought I knew. That's basically, I think, crucial. And we see it all around us on the political side. There's no doubt about it. We are undergoing that kind of historical revisionism and it's not simply for the better. I think it's a matter of, certainly in terms of this country, it's a matter of our survival. If we don't do it, we are destined to, we've seen what the consequences of that are. There's a way in which that's always true, right? We're constantly reevaluating. But now I think there's a premium on that kind of like reassessment of, all aspects of historical experience. And I would hope that this series, at least implicitly in all its titles, does something like that. Okay, that's a Joe Biden answer to a short question. Actually, it was a Joe Biden question, kind of. So,
I'm reclaiming Joe Biden. Maybe it's a positive thing.
I don't know.
You
Anything else?
shouldn't.
Yeah, no. Anything else before we move on? Any other thoughts or questions? Again, I know some of you read the book, and I'd be, yeah.
Mr. Rexer, I would like to ask, and this is in part perhaps a follow-up from the last thoughts there, but as you discover these works and the thoughts they're triggering for you about this access to the past, the new, I think at one point you put it that way, we have a different access to the past. Are the artists that you're able to interact with, do they share thoughts with you about why or why now that is showing up in their work? It could be such a mixture of things, their personal paths, etc. But if you're seeing a sort of, a commonality across these different things, has any thoughts been shared or discussions included? Why now? Why in a different decade was there not a new access to the past?
There has been. And one of the things that when I think Bob is going to talk a little bit, you'll see that a lot of ideas have been out there, but they get buried. And we could talk over and over again about this, but remember, I once had an undergraduate student who gave a lecture in one of my classes, and this was quite a while ago. and his presentation was the influence, I'm just going to make this up, but you'll get the idea. The influence of Walker Evans on William Henry Fox Talbot. And of course, the class was just like utterly scratching their head because, it's like, well, what possible influence could someone who came, 50 years after, almost 100 years after Fox Talbot, actually have to, how could it influence a dead photographer? Of course, what the student was talking about is our experience of the past and how every new thing is a constant, forces a kind of constant reinterpretation. So there's that. However, I do think in many cases, individual photographers, first of all, have a ridiculously, not all of them, but many of them have a kind of hyper sense of operating in a kind of historical context. It's not that they're all students of history, but there are ways in which they are perfectly aware that the decisions that they are making are contradicting certain past practices or expanding certain past practices. That kind of hyper awareness is everywhere in the visual arts, but it's certainly in photography, it's almost impossible. It's a burden, in fact, for many photographers, and that's why we have that kind of embrace of the cliche, because there is a kind of felt burden for anyone who wants to take pictures that matter. That said, there are a lot of individual motives where I think artists have, again, taken very specific positions on the past and on the present. Like, for example, a lot of people who were operating in alternative media, for example, often will tell you that they have aligned themselves against digital culture. That's the way they think of it. And, they give you lots and lots of arguments about that. I actually don't think that that's what's really going on. So I always take, to some degree, I take what artists say with a grain of salt. In other words, the reasons why they do something may not be exactly an accurate reflection of the context in which they're operating. And it's the context, again, that's more important to me. So are people working or making daguerreotypes anti-digital? Not at all. In fact, what they are invariably aware of is the digital environment in which they're operating. And that's true of a lot of things that look conservative, and they might be, but they are at the same time perfectly aware of whatever it is they're not doing. And where does much of this work come from? How do you contextualize a lot of this work? I think that you have to talk about the digital revolution. That's obviously a more extended discussion, but that is the water that we're swimming in. And even though many photographers are operating with traditional media still, there is absolutely no question that the context in which they are working and what actually makes the work meaningful is this kind of tremendous revolution in sort of exchanging photographs, making photographs, and using photographs. These things all go together, and it would be an entire career to articulate exactly what the relationship is with a bad, like a bad daguerreotype made in a class someplace and an AI program. But that's one of the things I'm still trying to do. So that, that's again, that's a Biden answer to a short question. But the question is not simple. The answers are not simple. Anyone else? Okay, good. So we can move on. We can move away from me. I wanted to jump to Bob Bowen. What I've asked my three visitors, my three interlocutors to do is to just put together just a few images and to give me a kind of state of their research. Where are they? What are their primary themes that they're working on? And when I think they do this, you'll have a sense about why, A, I'm excited about the potential for this series, and B, why I think they are appropriate, okay? So I wanted to introduce Bob Bowen first. And I know I'm gonna get out of stop sharing my screen, and I know Bob has a few things that he wants to talk about. So I'll just, I'll be quiet, and Bob, you can take the stage.
Thank you, Lyle. Can you hear me? I guess you can, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I brought a few pictures to show, and I have a paragraph to read for a couple of these things. So I'd like to share my screen. So let me do that. How do I do that exactly? Okay, let's try again. So people can hear me, right? And they can see my screen. So that's good. All right. So the book title is The Human Shutter, as I said, and it's a book about how the stereoscopic image informs the moving image. Stereographs are a hybrid of still and moving, and chronostereographs, which is sort of a weird word that I kind of came up with, are stereographs contaminated with duration or symbols of duration. So this is an example of a stereograph with a symbol of duration. And let me just read a paragraph about this one. This is by an American photographer, F.G. Weller.
Hey, Bob?
Yes.
Lyle. Your image is not up.
Oh.
Okay.
All right.
Which means you have to, when you share, you have to click on the specific screen on your, you'll have various options on your desktop. You have to do what you did before. Click on the screen you want.
Got it. Okay, let's try that. Okay. Share.
Yeah, there you go.
So, okay.
Yeah, there we go.
So you see this F.G. Weller picture now? Yes. Okay. I play again. So view of a beautiful young woman with a ghostly translucent winged hourglass supported by floating hands, just forward and above the young woman's gaze. It's a memento mori, an allegory of time. The young girl's beauty will fade. There are Christian overtones along with a spirit photography vibe. Okay, so that's sort of my first image that I'm showing that's a traditional 19th century stereograph, but it has this sort of symbolic time, contamination to it. Okay, so now we'll go here. So this stereo view with the strange title of Movie Men at Work at St. Augustine, Florida, movie with the two O's. So it turns out that they're making what's called a biblical epic, a silent biblical epic at the summer studios of Pathé. And I think this is interesting because Marshall McLuhan understood that a medium's true content is always other older mediums. But in this stereograph, it reverses the temporal flow and anticipates the medium that will supersede it. It is also a document of early silent cinema about simulating an ancient time frame within a modern medium. Okay. Next is this one from the 1860s, Alfred Sylvester. So this is interesting because it's a representation of faux instantaneity. So, at some moment, as in the stereo view I'm going to show next, they had the technical capability of capturing action in real time on the street. So here, in this image, this is a completely fake instant, because in 1860, it wasn't capable, the technology wasn't there to capture the moment. In this case, Sylvester is cribbing from a famous painting at the time by painter William Powell Frith entitled Derby Day. And let's see, so the people in this picture that you see are holding poses, similar to the pastime of that era known as tableau vivant, in which people mimicked scenes from literature, poetry, and painting as a parlor entertainment. Interesting here is that the subject is the horse in motion, which is taken up again 20 years later by Muybridge in order to settle Stanford's famous bet. But here, the paper mache horses are already frozen in time some 20 years earlier. Okay, here. So this is Lower Broadway, 1860, and this is one of the first instantaneous views from E&H.T. Anthony Company. And what's remarkable here is that Anthony is saying he's so great at capturing the motion of life on the street that he can even do it in the rain. So that's what's happening here. The philosopher Bergson claimed that instantaneous photography was the quintessential apparatus of modernity. Now they start to get more interested. This image is by Joseph Spitthofer, a German photographer working in Rome in the 1860s. And this is the Roman Forum, Temple of Antoninus and Faustina. And so what's interesting here, and you can see it in the images, is that on the left you have trees visible on the left side, and on the right image the trees aren't there. So what this is a profound space-time thought experiment, asking our brains to parse this photo that is taken. It's an extreme diachronic montage where the images are taken at two quite different time periods. In one case, it's recent plantings, and on the other side, the trees have grown up. And so intentional or not, Spithover has created a visual time machine that seizes the brain and forces us to process a stereoscopic fusion of two images separated by extreme duration. We see these planted trees, full grown on one side and not yet grown on the other. It's one of the subtlest and most suggestive durational stereographic images ever created. It is perhaps as close as we'll ever get to experiencing the tesseract of Borges's Aleph. Okay, this is actually a crop of an image by Giorgio Sommer of this street in Naples. Sommer is the auteur and flaneur of two-frame microcinema. Sommer captured on glass plates and stereographs what was described by Poe and Baudelaire, George Simmel, and Walter Benjamin. His arresting stereo photographs explicitly show what the flaneurs saw in stereoscopic recordings of crowd movement in early modernity. An archaeology of urbanism is revealed in images by this German photographer. Curiously, Naples was also the summer home of E.J. Murray. Speculations regarding the likelihood of spatio-temporal overlaps should be considered. The image suggests the cinematic effect of a walking man amidst the blur of traffic on the Riviera di Chiaia. Towards the end of his career, Sommer's business overlapped with the burgeoning Italian film industry located in the same Neapolitan neighborhood near the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II. So there's a figure here. You can see him with his legs apart and here together. And in the next slide, whoops. It should be walking, but it's not. So imagine the figure there walking. I'm going to kind of just move on here. Don't know why it's not walking. But here's the next one. This is by Herwood Carrington. He's a stage magician, and he's created this tableau called Pharaoh's Daughter, which relates to the story of Pygmalion and Gradiva with an added sort of fashionable Egyptian theme. The experience is of a stone statue coming to life, and in this case, it is across two frames of a stereograph. So you actually, yes, you view that in stereo, and then by sort of adjusting your vision, you see the stone statue coming to life. This sort of two-frame cinema that I'm looking at, this like micro cinema, has a lot to do with Flickr films. And so Peter Gabelka created the first Flickr film in 1960, known as Arnold Raynor. And so in what you're looking at is a transcoding by Gabelka of the film as an installation of celluloid pinned to a white wall. And you can, the advantage of this is you sort of see the entire Flickr film laid out before you as these sequence of clear and black frames. And then the final image I was about to show is this one. This is a unresolvable anaglyphic film still from Lucy Raven's Curtains 2014. Raven explores binocular depth in the extended dimensions of Henri Lefebvre's theory of the production of space. Raven highlights the underpaid, fragmented pools of labor in China and India who are doing 3D conversions of films where the illusion of depth is invented. At this point in time, there is a far smaller market, meaning now, there's a far smaller market for such 3D conversions. And so I have to wonder what has happened to these labor pools. Okay, those are all the images that I'm going to share tonight. And maybe that'll bring you into some of my thinking about what this book is going to be about. So I'll turn it back over to you, Lyle, maybe.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Bob, I have a lot of questions. And I do want to make our progress through the evening relatively efficient. In that regard, I do have a couple of questions, or I want to rephrase a few things. As I look at your proposal and at the images that you've shown, you seem to be making a case that the stereograph, first of all, has not been adequately attended to. There obviously have been a number of projects that have dealt with stereophotography, but it seems to me that you're making a much more substantial claim about that early form of photography. And one of the things, as I interpret it, is that, well, several things. You can tell me if I'm right. That perceptually, the notion of a stereograph was bound up with attempts to render the movement of time, not only by just the process of our eyes having to parse the stereo image, but as you've shown, some very explicit gestures that were made that look like early GIFs, you might say, explicit gestures that were made to incorporate aspects of of time passing. So this is kind of still moving stuff at a very conscious level, early on. That it, again, as you say, it comes out of a kind of perceptual apparatus, putting two images together so that our eyes in stereo create a dimensional resolution, shall we say. And from that, it seems to me that there's an enormous amount or enormous implications for this in terms of our sort of visual ecology now.
Well, Lyle, let me just say, I would go farther than that. And I just didn't have the space to, fully open up tonight for this. But like when,
Bob, before we go further, can you stop sharing your screen?
Sure, yes.
Okay, so we can see you.
There.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so the first chapter of the book, the main idea is that the founders of photography, Herschel and Talbot and Antoine Claudet and Michael Faraday, that when they used the word photography, they meant something different than what we think photography means. I mean, the tradition has been that photography was the still image, but for those guys, and I think I can prove it with primary sources, they didn't mean that. They meant varying the modes of perception with still moving and depth, quite honestly. And I will cite sources to that.
Yeah, and the other thing that strikes me about this, and again, the reason why I'm intrigued by this, although I like the argument to begin with, but the environment in which your investigation is taking place comes out of a kind of broader sort of theoretical environment as well. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about kind of like what's shaping this investigation for you.
Well, I mean, I was sort of partially born out of avant-garde film and out of photography. And so, and I've been obsessed with stereo images since I was an undergraduate, and someone showed a Marcel Duchamp picture called the Handmade Stereopticon slide. And so actually that started this whole process. But so those three things are, have come together for me. I've had a long relationship with people like Ken Jacobs. I was a student of his back in the early 70s. And so to think of, still moving and depth together is just sort of a natural thing to do for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing I would say is that if you look at contemporary media theorists, their attitude toward many of their attitudes toward the still image is that it's either a mistake or it's vestigial. And their whole notion of photographic history is either based on information theory or it's based on the idea that where images really want to go at the end of the day, at least in Western conceptions, is toward the representation of time in experience, right? And that if we look at and if you force us to go back and look at the origin of photography, what we see is that has always been the desire.
Yes, the founders, that's exactly, Wedgwood thought that.
Right. Right. And that seems to me to be, I mean, that's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, certainly since I read your proposal, but also just more generally, as I've had to come to grips with media theory and its approach to the history of photography, because it's really quite different. And I find a lot to disagree with, but when it comes to kind of rethinking exactly what we thought was at stake, especially for people like us who are so immersed in still imagery, it's a wake-up call to see that, in fact, the people who were actually making the images recognized that they were dealing with a limitation, and that it was a limitation they wanted to overcome. That limitation was the still image itself.
I think if I can interrupt, I think
Yeah.
Bergson's first book was titled, on duration, was titled The Idea of Consciousness. And the person, Deleuze's first volume, which I know Bob's read,
Yes.
follows up on that. So I think at heart, this issue of consciousness has always been pervasive in the concept of la durée.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. What I'd like to do, unless those people have objections, I really like to move on, because there's a weird way in which this segues pretty in an interesting fashion into the kind of work that Keren Moskovic is doing. And I wonder if, Keren, if you could share your screen, talk a little bit about the project that you're working on. It's very different from what we've just heard Bob working on, but it has implications that I think are really important for photography, and it exists in I think in a similar environment intellectually.
Sure. Thank you, Lyle, and thank you, Bob. That was fascinating. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, cool. So I'm interested in this idea of object orientation, which describes a set of theories and practices that broadly ask us to put aside our ideas about ourselves as human subjects in favor of a new way of thinking. Some of these include object-oriented ontology, object-oriented feminism, and object-oriented photography. So flipping from subject-oriented to object-oriented thought. What do I mean by subjectivity? We can think of it as this idea of the self as a distinct entity with thoughts, feelings, perception, perspective, memory, vision. We also tend to be the subjects of our own human-centric stories. This is our dominant ideology. So how do ideology and the visual field co-create and reinforce one another? According to Jonathan Crary, vision and its effects are always inseparable from the possibilities of an observing subject who is both the historical product and the site of certain practices, techniques, institutions, and procedures of subjectification. Our modern relationship to photography has generally been anthropocentric, human-centered. We as humans claim the right to know and to see realistically, scientifically, poetically, and we also have a desire to be seen. The camera has been an important tool for us modern humans. But now we've moved beyond, or perhaps to a different stage of modernism, and both technology and ideology are shifting. Here's the first photograph of a black hole made in 2017 by 8 arrays of telescopes around the globe, taking measurements over the course of 4 days, 5 petabytes worth of data. I've never heard of a petabyte before. This image is pretty far removed from subjective human vision, at least in its creation. So we need a new language for photography and photo-adjacent practices. Philosophy is always looking for new languages to describe human existence, and since photography and humans have evolved together and will probably continue to do so into the future, philosophy offers some tools. Object orientation is one pathway that we might take. And this is a portrait of Pussy Riot member Ekaterina Samutsevic, made by facial recognition software developed in Moscow for the purpose of public surveillance. These contemporary thinkers, thank you, Lyle, have set down important paving stones towards shifting our understanding of how bodies, objects, and vision operate through media that has historically been tethered to subjectivity, vision, and presence, which includes addressing and revising the rights and privileges that certain subjects hold over others. So object-oriented theories and practices are redirected towards objects, including humans as objects, in order to level the ontological playing field between humans and other entities, both living and non-living. This creates an opportunity for speculation about reality beyond the framework of human thought. So with new technologies, we now also have a new visual paradigm, and with it, new existential considerations for human beings. In an era of big data, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, facial recognition, and mass surveillance, decentering human subjectivity and paying attention to the invisible world of objects, data, and other matters, corresponds to the digital realm that increasingly controls our lives. So this is Catherine Behar's Knock Knock. It's a video still, you unfortunately can't see it move, but two Alexas entertain each other in a cryptographic guessing game that exceeds human intelligence as well as human patience. So Behar founded object-oriented feminism, which is a kind of performative feminist theory. It actually is the theory that got me started thinking about object orientation. This image was generated by what's called periodolic computer vision, or deep dreaming AI, which uses algorithms to induce artificial dreams and hallucinations, also something that we think of as very subject-centered. According to artist Trevor Paglen, if we want to understand the invisible world of machine-machine visual culture, we need to unlearn how to see like humans. So here, Paglen shows us the internal mechanisms of machine vision, including where it makes what we would consider to be errors. So rather than dehumanizing photography, I believe that object orientation allows us to better grasp the contemporary world, its media, and its artists. It offers a contemporary philosophical system that works with ideas borrowed from computer programming, as well as various theories of perception, knowledge, and aesthetics. Object orientation isn't just about what's visible, it's actually about what's invisible being equally as important and impactful as what's visible, like this black hole that I showed you earlier. That includes the imagination, but it also includes people who are invisible to the dominant society, like these people in a refugee camp, photographed with heat sensors, as well as the invisible directives of ideology, like the ones that power AI and also racism, classism, sexism, etc., ideology in general. So if some humans are essentially made invisible by voids in representation and errors in coding, or made overly visible beyond their control, as in the case of surveillance, objectification, and criminalization, then the interplay of both visible and invisible objects in a mesh of objects that includes humans becomes a really relevant paradigm from which to understand and possibly even disrupt the workings of ideology on the real lives of humans. So object orientation creates a new conversation, and not just around artists who are explicitly working with AI. Artists who may be working in more traditional photographic modes express a new reality, the new vision, perhaps, of the 21st century. Tommy Ha, in one example, has 3D printed his own face into a mask and photographs it on other people's bodies, as well as in funny and unsettling still lifes. So if our dominant paradigm of today is subjectivity, then questioning that means operating in protest of existing power structures. Also, if the paradigm of our reality is shifting away from the human subject's primacy, away from the visible, away from representation and towards something else, perhaps the object world, looking beyond that dominant paradigm is necessarily looking into the future. And I'm also particularly interested in gender and intimacy as radical practice. And it's relevant in this context because technology is incredibly intimate. Here, Danny Lesnow has turned her vagina into a camera obscura that photographs her lovers. And Paul Mpagi Sipuya, who creates a sort of cyborgian, human machine, intimate body that reorganizes binding categories such as gender and race into new compound beings. His work also deconstructs the singular camera-centric gaze into a visual system that looks through and with objects and technologies. Patricia Voulgaris works with the body as a sort of withdrawn object, which is another object-oriented concept, rejecting the patriarchal gaze and deconstructing the modernist canon by appropriating its forms. Even though these images appear on their surface to be standard photographs made by traditional visual tools, I'm interested in how these artists employ the tenets of object orientation, such as metaphor, theatricality, carpentry, allure, and withdrawal. And Ren Heng liberates the confined body from its subjection to individuality and identity, instead stepping into ecological intimacy and collectivity. Bodies operate as data sets and attributes working in unison, yet self-contained, challenging human vision. And here, artist Stephanie Dinkins has befriended a robot named Bina 48, who is equipped with artificial intelligence, technology that threatens to surpass human capacity for thought, emotion, and perhaps even love. Bina 48 is modeled after a real Black woman, so a portrait of sorts, but programmed by white men, which is an example of the problems of universal subjectivity. By interacting with Bina 48, Dinkins is curious to see if the robot can develop a sense of herself as a member of the Black community. For Dinkins, what I'm referring to as object orientation is a social and political practice. According to Dinkins, we are at the start of this new epoch that's going to change everything: the way we live, the way we love, the way we remember. And we humans have a lot of work to do to make sure that the AI world that we're creating right now is inclusive, diverse, and transparent. So object orientation presents more than aesthetic, social, or even political implications. Whether we like it or not, we are becoming objects in a world of objects. And object orientation gives us language and tools for forward-looking practice. And that is why I'm interested in it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Keren, you've heaped our plate here. Yeah, as with Bob, I mean, these are absolutely topics for much more extended conversations. But I have a couple of things that I wonder if you can clarify for me. It does seem to me that if we're thinking about the history of photography and we're thinking about the history of media, the camera is is a tool of objectification. So it's perfectly appropriate that this is where the discussion of object orientation in philosophy as well as in the visual arts should happen. But what I'm thinking of is it suggests to me that that traditional, something very traditional about photography right from the start, which was that the camera was at once, it was the herald of things to come, the tremendous advantage. It is that thing that Moholy Nagy says, it gives us eyes outside our body, which is, I think, one of the things that you're really trying to talk about. At the same time, it is that thing that Baudelaire hated so much. The idea that that object that denies subjectivity completely. It denies individuality. It denies all the things that for, basically 19th century France, or certainly for Baudelaire as a kind of an avatar, was the problem. So that the camera is both a liberation and you might say, the the tool of oppression at the same time. And I find that that sort of thinking runs through a lot of what you're trying to work out in this brave new world. And it kind of stands in for a lot of other kind of related, as you call them, adjacent technologies.
Absolutely. You know, I mentioned that I got interested in object-oriented theory actually through object-oriented feminism, which was developed by Catherine Behar as almost like a response to object-oriented ontology, because object-oriented ontology emerged as a very white, very male field.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
very, you know, the object-oriented ontologists that have actually done sort of analyses of photographers. Lyle, I've shared some of that with you. You know, Winogrand is a big one. You know, he took pictures of the things themselves and sort of an object amongst other objects. But there's sort of something missing about, well, what if not everybody really gets to be a full subject? What does that mean for photography?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that that's been a continuing source of that is a central issue in sort of photographic practice, has been forever. And it continues to be something that's kind of like constantly being fought out, right? That kind
Absolutely.
and it's not just a question of power, but it's a question of of how the technology can possibly be employed. Other thing I wanted to add, and then I want to move on, or ask, I suppose, the question is, are there implications for a kind of ecological view? Because I think that was the crucial thing I wanted to hear more about. That idea that, you know, again, Moholy-Nagy's idea about eyes outside our bodies, so that it gives these kinds of technologies give us access, the same way that they are tools of oppression for sure, but they also give us access to perspectives that are tremendously important in terms of, especially in big data, really important in terms of like how we think about the natural world.
Yeah.
Because we have to move to a different place on that.
Well, exactly. And you hit on something that's really important to me as well in this research, which is this notion of ecological intimacy, and also thinking about ecology, what Timothy Morton calls ecology without nature. So
Yes.
sort of this idea that we have to let go of some of our romanticized ideas, not only about nature, but about ourselves, in order to
In that relation.
And also to really be able to manage and deal with the real ecology that we're living in right now, which is where, you know, with big data, like your portrait in the world of data is completely fragmented and completely divorced from your singular body and completely divorced from your control, actually. So how do we deal with that? How do we make images, and how do we sort of collect images and talk about images and even look back at images? You know, Trevor Paglen talks about Carlton Watkins as a spy satellite. Like, what, like that makes so much sense to me, right? Because he's like surveying land in a way that the spy satellites do now. So we're thinking about the entire
and Winogrand was the first Google camera.
Totally first Google camera.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's break us away from some of these ways of thinking that are, I mean, they make us feel good, but they actually don't describe what our reality is at all.
Yeah.
It's like making Gary Winogrand into a sort of political, social, whatever kind of photographer. That just strikes me as like utter insanity. I can't wait to see how this develops. I'm excited for this, and I'll have a lot more questions for you, obviously, as this goes on. But I wanted to move to Yasi as our kind of privileged outsider in so many ways. And see, Yasi shared with me earlier in the day some pictures that were familiar to me because I've been in his studio in the past and really, really enjoyed what I saw. So I wondered if you'd share those pictures now, and maybe we can talk a little bit about kind of the kinds of reevaluations that you've attempted to do, kind of operating in some really traditional forms, or at least forms of work that have, let's say, traditional roots.
Yeah, let me, you would think after all this time of, okay. You would think after teaching on Zoom, I would be comfortable with figuring this out, but here I am. First, let me make sure I have on video. Hopefully you'll hear the sound. If not, let me know, we'll figure it out. Lyle, it's been interesting. Keren, it's been really amazing hearing you talk. Not that I believe in segues, or I believe in the failure of segues. But it's also been interesting to think about this question of subjecthood. And it's interesting because I'm critical of all words, but it's like, what does it mean to come to this conversation from the post-colonial, post-imperial experience? Or it's interesting to talk about Paglin or look at the images of refugee crisis, and just remember that the war happened. I think a lot about what it means to be contemporary and relate to the Middle East as this like exotified other, basically. With that, or with everything else, what I have is mostly representation of stuff I'm thinking about in the studio. It's going to be a bit of rambling. If anyone wants to interrupt me at any point, please do. But a lot of what I ask is what it means to be a contemporary Iranian artist functioning in New York. And usually I start this by thinking about like two things about it that for me feels paradoxical or complicated. One is, how do we talk about the contemporary moment of the Iranian society? It's complicated to say the least, which is usually how I show this video. Hopefully you'll hear the sound. Yeah. Did you have sound?
No, there should be a place where you can authorize the sound.
Okay, let me make sure up to my screen for video. So let's see. It's a loud sound. To explain what you're looking at, it's not my work. It's a video that was posted around 4 years ago on social media and kind of moved around. I'm interested in the video because it's right after an election of a president that totally did not function because things are not great in Iran. But there was an act of protest and a celebration right after. The process of going back to voting has its own history in Iran. What I'm interested in is the dancing as an act of protest, the mundane in all that is this video. The song they sing is the student movement's anthem. It's a song that loops, so you can sing it for hours. We used to just like go round and round and just repeat it. And many other questions. The truth is, I've been revisiting this video for 4 years, and I think it explains something that I don't think can be translated about what I mean by contemporary Iran. But let's see if you hear it. Is there sound?
No. And
Okay.
I think what has to happen for this program is you've got to,
Let me stop share and share again.
you have to authorize, the sound has to, there's a box you can click where the video sound can be authorized.
Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna retry it. Hopefully it will work. No?
Not
the
yet.
Videos. Okay, let me try this because sometimes this helps. Okay.
There we go. That works.
And that's it. And that's where the video ends. And sometimes while returning to that video, I wonder if the question is, can I translate that video to my audience, like all of you here? Or is it that just I miss having my body in there or being able to join that dance? The other part of what it means to be from Iran is this conversation with a different visual history. So it's been interesting to receive an education in New York, but the same questions repeat within Iran too, where a lot of the conversations around how the camera functions or how we understand contemporary art always filters through one narrative of art history, more or less, which is very Eurocentric. So the way I think about it just erases my body. I'm interested in how, being someone who grew up in the 2000s, we received a lot of material from everywhere, but we were surrounded by these images. This is an image of one of the iconic ceilings of like the works of Islamic abstract geometric art. This is the Sheikh Fazlul Lahmas in Isfahan. And there are different things about it. So one is just my personal experience with those. If anyone has ever had a chance to be in a mosque like this, there's something about it that is completely, it floors you. Even though it's not about the individual, it's not even about being impressive. It's just like how it occupies space. But I'm also interested in what it means to be a contemporary artist that kind of engages with this history and tries to read it, tries to understand it without any like romanticized nationalist perspective on it. There's, to quote Ito Barada, there's an early quote of her where she says, "I'm not exotic, I'm exhausted." So I'm interested in the exhaustion part. It's a good quote. And the other thing I want you to keep in mind is that the relationship we have with abstract geometry is not just about the architecture around us, but it's also in mundane designs. So from like bureaucratic signs to how people would draw a snowflake. Just, I have more on that if anyone has more questions. With that, I'm going to introduce one finished body of work that is fairly recent and then throw you some ideas that are currently in the studio. So what I'm going to show first is from a body of work called Dreams Became History, a second-hand history of Iran from 1979 to 1989, a puzzle, a game of fortune, and a book that failed to be published. So for this body of work, a lot of my work relates to writing, oral histories, and political contradictions, Iran, and a lot of works on paper, folding, experimentations with abstraction and geometry, borrowing from that history. Did I mention folding? I fold paper. For this body of work, I collected 64.
Okay. Thanks. I will just throw it on the floor here.
What?
Just throw it on the floor.
Okay, can you please?
I need to move. I'm sorry, my hand. My leg, brother. Here. Sorry.
Okay. Hopefully this person will pass. So I collected 64 stories that go, they're memories from that decade. That decade starts with the Iranian Revolution and ends by the end of the war. The stories are not mine. They're collected from people my age. I was born on 1989. So we were all born and raised right after that decade where so much happened, from like the war itself to the revolution to this political group taking power, the other one taking power. A lot of contradiction, a lot of trauma. I must say a lot of my early political formation relating to the Green Movement and the Arab Spring was trying to make sense of that decade. And after a decade of thinking about it, we realized it doesn't make sense. But what we did grow up with was stories from that decade that were designed for kids. So I asked people who were born after to give me their top 5 favorite memories of that decade. And what they give me is stories their parents would tell them. So I have only 2 of the stories. So I'm gonna read you this one because I like this one. The clergy has won the power race and the revolution is officially titled Islamic. There are strict rules in place, including mandatory hijab and a ban on basically anything Western. My parents are married by then. They got bored during the many years that the universities were closed. One by one, all their friends got married and eventually so did they. My mom is 7 months pregnant and eventually, no, my mom is 7 months pregnant with me. One day, my parents are stopped by the Basij patrols while driving the streets. These patrols, recruited by the young supporters of the new government, try to enforce the new strict rules. However, the rules are neither written nor clear. On the stop, my parents lose their favorite Charles Navute. The young patrolling officer criticizes my dad for the dress my mom was wearing. The dress is long and loose, just as they had demanded, but the officer is upset because it has a floral pattern that makes my mom, quote, look good. And then the way, so one part of it is the folds that are paired with each of the stories. The folds are my process of trying to reverse engineer the Islamic dome. So they're a blueprint. And each story has its own fold and they're all folded by me. So it's the same algorithm repeating, but it's all by my hand and my body. So there's errors, you wouldn't notice errors. But the idea is, if you use the structure, you can make yourself a dome. I don't think anyone but me could, but technically you could. The other way the story was activated is I've performed this in different places where I use it as a game of fortune telling, where the audience, it's an Iranian tradition. We usually do it with a book of poetry because Iranians in poetry, where you ask the book a specific question, you trust the wisdom of the book and say a specific thing to announce that you trust the wisdom of the book, and then you open a random page. And that random page will be your answer. It's been really fun playing that game with young, especially young SVA kids. Because every once in a while, they're like, Yasi, you should play too. And I'm like, this has been my fortune. Like, I've played this game all my life. And the stories constantly repeat. It's like my mom, my dad, my uncle, but none of them are me. It's just the people in my generation, and our parents had different political views. So you have Marxists, you have Islamist Marxists, you have apolitical people, you have the war, you have people who died in the war, you have people in prison and you don't know why they're in prison. This is the only one photograph that is within the collection, and it is my only submission. Some people might recognize the photograph that is within. It's a photograph of the occupation of the American embassy. Yeah. I had the file on my computer and the file itself distorted it. So like 2/3 of it ended up being like blacked out, which was way too good. So that's my submission. Everything else in the story is around text. Also, the collection of the text happened through mostly WhatsApp and Instagram. But then that's how the book that wanted to be a puzzle, that wanted to be a game of fortune telling, became an exhibition. And as for the puzzle, is like you can try to match the stack of cards to the bigger map. And it has very much been about me trying to find a system to make sense of this history. But you can't. It's like, it's not a linear narrative. One of the reasons why it didn't happen is because my publisher wanted an introduction that was linear, which I couldn't. It's not a linear history. But there's a lot about what's at the center. So I start sorting things. So 79 is close to the center of the revolution itself, and then it goes out, and everything is symmetrical, so things can be solved in different locations. This is the other story I have from the book. He says, one day when the rockets were raining over the city, one of my aunts, who was only 3 or 4 years old, gets totally tongue-tied. My dad and a couple of my uncles got together and played with her for hours to make her talk again. They were worried that she'd become mute, but finally they managed to make her laugh. And I don't know if anyone else here has kind of thought about like generational conversations and historic trauma, but it's interesting. My generation is fairly obsessed with talking about that decade. Our parents stopped answering questions when we grew up. Most of the time we were blaming them, so I understand why they stopped. But these stories remain what we had. I have a lot more to say about all of these, but I will try to keep this short. So I will move to my work in progress. You can see some of these things around me. There's a lot of new folds and thinking about the forms coming together. I work from 3 references, and like all the forms come from that. But I have 2 main thoughts right now. So I will share the narrative that is around it as we go through the work. If you have questions about the work, just ask me.
But I want to start with this tweet, which is a weird tweet, but it was on point. I'm going to read things out loud because life. It says, I have an Iranian joke, but it's censored in Iran and sanctioned in the US. It's too good.
Well, we can't tell that joke.
I told you nothing. But that's something I've been asking a lot. So I know Iran is kind of known as this exception to the rule, but the truth is I just think it's kind of a caricature of like everything that is fucked up and happening. So I think there's some very bitter irony about living under neoliberal sanction and like old school dictatorship, censorship.
Right, at the same time.
At the same time. So I began asking then, what is it? What is my obsession about thinking about Tehran or telling the story of this city? So as I'm going through this, I've been thinking a lot about maps and where Tehran is. And then I've been thinking a lot about measuring time. So to kind of give you a bit on my thoughts around maps, this is the story where I started to think about it. Imagine we're standing in the middle of Tehran, one of the busy squares. It's around a year and a half ago. I've just left the cafe. I'm talking to my friend, like friends I know from my undergrad in Iran. We're smoking our cigarettes. I'm waiting for my like share ride. And behind me, someone's yelling on the phone, I mean, like, I send you the stuff over WhatsApp. It's mundane. It's mundane. It's 2019. It was like January 2019. And it's everything we know about 2019. Now, if we zoom a bit out, if we just zoom out and look at this with context, I would tell you as someone who has just come back to Tehran for a trip from New York, that because of the sanctions, the app I'm using is not Uber, it's not Lyft, it's none of those similar global structures, because none of these companies are allowed to have financial transactions with Iran, sanctions. So it has taken me over a week to find a solution to get this Iranian version of the app on my iPhone. You have to download something else, then you can download something else, and then it's always changing because again, you're kind of crossing the sanction. And the person who's yelling behind me as he's talking about WhatsApp, and people are doing everything through WhatsApp. If you know Iran, you would know WhatsApp is censored. Before that, everyone was using Telegram. Telegram is censored. Still, people are doing this. There's like mundane acts of I don't know if it's like revolt, I don't know if it's survival, but it's definitely laborious. And one way all of these things work is through VPNs. And if anyone is familiar with the idea of VPNs, it's that it sends you to another location momentarily and randomly. And that's how you do things, that for a short time, your data is related to somewhere else. So I keep asking myself, okay, let's zoom out. Let's leave the square, leave the fact that we know all these people are doing these like repeated performances. We get on the flights and we're leaving Tehran. If I'm supposed to talk about Tehran through the data, I'm supposed to sit in New York and talk about Tehran, then the city doesn't exist. No lights are on, no data is being produced. And that's how everything functions. If you're under sanction and censorship, the way you function is being sent elsewhere randomly and momentarily. Then I wonder, what is it that I'm trying to map? What does it mean to try to tell the story of this city? These are some recent pieces of work where I'm thinking a lot about the border of Iran, so I map the city and then let the grid take over. Or what it means, what are the ethics of telling the story of this city? I have a similar but different story that thinks about time difference and Tehran. And then this story is probably from a few years ago. Again, it's filled with like mundane acts. I'm thinking about like sitting in front of TV, it's like the World Cups, it's the finals, or it's the Champions League. We're watching soccer. And there's a specific moment that would be familiar to any Iranian, but also potentially to other international artists in different ways. But our TV would show the games, the national TV would purchase and show the games because people are obsessed with soccer, unlike here. But they would have a lap. There would be few minutes of a lap. So there would be a moment where your phone would notify you that someone has scored a goal, but you're refreshing to see what it is, but the internet is slower. So there's like, you're within this lag. You have the information that you're a few seconds behind. And that few second behind in Iran happened for two reasons. One, the speed of things being downloaded, but also because the government was horrified of people making out in the audience. So they left themselves a 5-second lag to censor, and then they would like show like videos of like people in the game from like 10 seconds ago on repeat. So I think about what it meant for things to be live. What did it mean to receive any information live while sitting in my living room in Tehran? And then what is my relationship to what is contemporary? As I'm thinking about this history, as I'm thinking about my relationship with this history, its contemporary moment, and then sitting in New York. This is probably way too personal, my current living room, because COVID. So as I'm thinking about all these questions more and more in the recent work, I'm thinking about horizons, being oddly nostalgic about borders in waters that I don't understand, and then measuring time and space. But I think that's it. I'm gonna finish with this image because I think it's like funny and fascinating. I was thinking for one of my classes, I'm teaching a new art history class about like colonialism. And the first day of class, I was asking everyone to bring things that they think are lost in translation. This is my pair. The vintage awe beauty image is something I found on social media and I thought it was beautiful. I have a tendency to include an image at the bottom of my emails. And I was sending it to my students and I was like, am I orientalizing the Orient? Like, will this look like I'm making fun of something? Or is it that I've been educated in orientalizing myself as I'm orientalizing the Orient? And I don't have any info around the image. I also think that moment is beautiful. So I'm completely floored by that image. The other image is something someone posted on WhatsApp and made it my way. It says Karl Marx, and it's a Iranian miniature portrait of Karl Marx, supposedly from when he was living or fairly early on. It's within an architectural structure, or maybe the stories I've heard were complete lies, but I think it's hilarious and I love it. And I love the rouge. I don't know who this weirdo Marxist was who wanted to have a face in the middle of all the abstract architecture stuff. But I'm gonna pause there. I'm gonna pause in that paradox. And that's it.
Great. I'm all in. But I do have a couple of questions, and I've had these questions since I visited your studio. This was quite a while ago. And I think the primary one that I'm so intrigued by is, and maybe that's too weak a word, is this idea of reverse engineering your history.
Right.
And that idea of having to go back and literally physically reconstruct a kind of a modality, which is like through the fold, to get at that kind of algorithmic approach to image making, which is so much a part of what sort of references to tradition have become all about. That it's kind of a default. And to feel that what you need to do is not deconstruct it, but reconstruct it in order to kind of just almost physically understand what that could possibly mean now. Right. I found that enormously poignant. And I wondered if that's sort of, I think that's what you're thinking, but you can correct me.
No, and I really appreciate that. And I have a tendency to not talk about the faults unless like people ask me. But yeah, something that is really interesting, I always think about the experience of looking at this, trying to understand it. And I know there was a moment where it was like, there's a logic to this. It's a language, I can read it. There has been moments where I see an abstract geometric form and I'm like, I can fold this. And if I can fold it, I understood its logic, I know what the moves were. but I have to understand it as a whole. And I think a lot of what happens in traditional discussions of abstract geometric architectural stuff is like mosaics coming together. It's about like the whole having the knowledge. There's also a lot of the text that is around works like these are either visitors that kind of see it as this like mystical, weird space, or it's nationalist narratives of see the greatness of it. And I always say that when I left this place, there's a lot of people who sell souvenirs, and by the time I was there, they were selling mosaics that had Pink Floyd written in the middle. They're not consumers, you know, it's like, it is contemporary. They're
Absolutely. Like Karl Marx, you know?
Like Karl Marx, right. It isn't a distant past. It kind of, you have this weird relationship with this object around you, but also how people want to engage with it. So for me, what was most fun, because I'm someone who also comes from a background of computer science, comes from parents who were mathematicians and likes math jokes, the idea of can I reverse engineer it? Or can I think about it as a game of logic? And logic is a subject that in general really interests me. So this was an attempt, like for years, I was like, what is the bigger logic? And I was like, okay, there's a lot around squares. What happens if you move the square? And it took me forever to realize that there weren't 4 squares, there were 3 squares that were then gridded. And when I fold things, like, I don't know how that, like, I don't know that I will get these designs in the middle. Right. What I do have is the 3 squares and then they get gridded. So there's a lot about experimenting, but Lyle, it has also been important to be in a position where I'm like, I can be wrong. Like I'm trying to understand this space. I mean, like there was some logic, there was some language there that wasn't otherworldly. It was a language and people were exploring it. The other way, like thinking about abstract geometry in the region is to think about, like, I remember I had a conversation with one of the curators of the Islamic department at the Met. It's like my last year at SVA. And I went to her and I was like, why did we choose abstraction? And it was this like sense of like, I'm tired of being seen as the not like anti-representational one. She was like, what do you mean, Yasi? Christians were around. It was a new empire. It needed a new look. Right? And like, she was like, Judaism had triangles, we had squares. And that's it. You start with triangles, you get a whole world of abstraction. And then you get Christians and they're obsessed with bodies. And then you get squares and you have a whole other world. Do I get to play in that? And then what does it mean to be in a contemporary moment and play with that? Mm-hmm. When I was doing the series of like repeating this one pattern, I folded some on a 12-hour flight. Like I would have my paper, I would like, as one of my teachers, you know, if I sit in a classroom, I'm folding. So I'm also interested in the process of like note making with all of this, or how they measure time basically. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I like the idea of reverse engineering or math jokes.
Yeah, math jokes. Yeah, no, I like math jokes too, but I'm not very good at them. No, again, you've heaped our plate. It's wonderful to see the work in progress, and I'm hoping at some point we'll be able to fold you into the series as well. I don't know what that's going to look like or how that's going to go, but you know, these are the different.
I'm happy.
Yeah, these are the very different perspectives and voices that I think it's really, really important for this series to bring to the table. And as I said, I want these books to be the kind of thing that, you know, 10 years from now, people go back and say, yeah, I really need to look at that, or tomorrow, or 5 years from now, whatever it is, but it's that thing that occupies a place that people feel they need to return to sort of get in touch with something that is important. And so I appreciate the 3 of you being here. I really appreciate the presentations you made. I also appreciate our visitors who've stuck with us. If you have any other questions, if there's anything you just want to ask our panelists, this is the chance to do that. Yeah, Jose, I see you. So let's unmute Jose. There you go.
I unmute myself. Well, congratulations. It is an incredible number of people and an incredible, gathering of talent. So Lyle, once more, my admiration to you and to all of you. I have a three questions, not for everyone, but, for different, in different cases. And because all the conversation that will happen today, all your presentations have sparked a lot of, a lot of ideas in me. Lyle, I wanted to ask you if, looking at the notion of history, and obviously, there's you were asked about this, not long ago, and your idea was one about even the very notion of what history is, keeps moving so much that obviously we are not talking about the same kind of past.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I wonder if there is a moment in which we need to recognize, obviously, that maybe a simple solution for what all the vernacular that we are seeing these days has to do with the fact that all of a sudden, photography, it was no longer a new media, quote unquote, and discover a trove of vernacular, of work. In there, all of a sudden, history became apparent. A large catalog of works became apparent, somehow, and that is a shift, obviously, circa 1980, circa 1990, that might also be informing something that you have been talking in your wonderful book, but that might be also interesting to push, into this conversation, into the forefront. For Keren, I love your presentation. It was incredible, and new materialism. It's not my cup of tea, put it that way. Okay? But I can see where they're coming from. But the wrestling with subjectivity, obviously, the erosion of the modern subject has happened basically, since, for the last 100 years, put it that way, and obviously much faster from the last 50. It started with, I can put great highlights of of that erosion. You have the death of the author, you have all the time, the death of the reader. Now you have the death of, all the time you are losing.
Death of the camera.
Death of the camera, exactly. You're losing that capacity of, but I wonder, and obviously, there is some sort of vis-a-vis that, I see new materialism as a sort of the final push of basically getting the modern subject out of the picture. But the problem is, how do you square that with political and emancipatory agendas if they're all about becoming subjects? There is a tension there that is very complicated to assess.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, and it's a tension that is not resolved. So, that's why I always sometimes even cringe about people talk about the body. That used to be the form of materialism that we had. And so instead of talking about people, we'll talk about bodies. And I was like, if the body is not connected to a brain, it doesn't have a person behind it. I don't know why is this important. Somehow there was a need for a sort of rooting in materialism. And I don't know if we can talk a little bit about that aspect in what you are posing, because I think it's the final question that you are ultimately posing there. What exactly are we doing? What if you're going to transform subjectivity as a technology, then we're done. We're kind of done, then I just turn off the light and leave, I don't know what to do, after that, how to recuperate all this thing.
And we might be done. That's part of it, right?
The last one to Yasi, I love the work of the geometry and the folding in itself. And I wonder if there is not a struggle, a connection there in a sort of a complicated tension between the perfect geometry somehow and the very coarse folding. And it's in that, the material aspect of it, that is just a coarse folding with the ideal plane, which is the perfect geometry, that is somehow, that is the space that you want to inhabit. That is a space in which is the lapse. It's this lapse that you are talking about that was so interesting. Those 2 seconds, 5 seconds in which geometry is basically, not longer, not being able to be something completely, that things have not been completely shown or completely figured out, in this case by surveillance or by different things. And you have those 2 seconds. And those 2 seconds have to do, or 5 seconds have to do with basically, some sort of getting out of the big grid. And that one way of showing that in the work is precisely by the folding versus the perfect geometrical pieces that you're working on. That's all what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jose.
I have following thoughts, if it's okay for me to jump in.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a great question. Before, as you were asking Keren, I'm really interested in hearing from you too. I don't know, when we talk about modernity, sometimes I'm like, is this why I'm in the room? Like, can we also talk about the other side of it? Like, do we want to talk about colonialism, or its relationship? Like, and it's hard. I don't say this simply. It's like, sometimes I'm like, I'm a third world post-revolutionary person. Like the other day in an interview, I was like, you know what, fuck it, I want democracy. Like, I don't know, as long as I'm being controlled, I want to have to say, I don't know if that makes me not revolutionary enough. But with technology too, I think sometimes we forget that we have proximity to it. Or especially as consumers, we have proximity to it, And then I wonder how that relates our different modes of, and it's interesting for me when you said like the 90s, like I'm kind of obsessed with the idea of before and after 89, right? Because if we were talking about civil societies and a futurity, then there would be like, you could be a Marxist. You're like, after 89, it's very different. You have this, or you have this, and you have this. So it's interesting how these questions come up there. Anyway, to go back to this idea of,
after 89, you can become a Marxist and many other things at the same time. Before it was just, you could only just be a Marxist.
It's real. I mean, and sometimes like I'm really interested in the kinds of debates I have, like with my friends, Marxist parents. Like I tell them about reading Fanon and Césaire, and I am asking them if they were reading these people in the 70s. And they answered me with a lot of patience, but seriously, one of them went to my friend the next day being like, is Yasi okay? Like, people go to New York to read Fanon? Like, isn't it 2020? Like, is she fine, And I know there's some repetition there. But to go back to this idea of geometry, something I really liked, I focused on paradoxes, right? Like when I finished my bachelor in computer science in Tehran. And my focus was on the liar's paradox. And it's a simple idea. It's like, if I told you everything I'm saying is a lie, is that a lie?
Yeah. And
then the whole word collapses, right? It's like, it just like blows up. The other day I was doing an interview with someone, and so I was thinking about that protest as we were, like, of that paradox as we were protesting on the street. Like we would go debate over Russells and then come on campus and protest against like the populists. And the person who was interviewing me was like, it's really interesting. A lot of people are thinking about notions of truth and lie in this moment because of what's happening in the US now. I'm like, that was 10 years ago in Iran. But honestly, we didn't think about the difference. We didn't think about the paradox of debating over like the liar's paradox and then fighting the populists on the street. It all collided. So something I really like, something that has been important for me about the process of folding is the surface of the paper gets really close to mathematical definitions rather than illustration, right? It's like a line is when the surface is folded. So it gets as close to pure mathematical definitions as we can, but then paper is such a weird, stubborn material. It fails, it has errors, humidity changes it, it doesn't listen to me. There's something so physical about the whole process. So I'm interested in my desire to solve the paradox, you know, my desire to flirt with these geometric forms, and then the committing of like so much time knowing it's going to fail. Like there are moments where it's like my paper just tears, and just like I still get shocked. I'm like, how are you shocked? You're doing this all the time. But there's a lot in those that interest me. Like at the end, I like to say, it's interesting for me. Sometimes I use these to like bug my friends who like got PhDs in mathematics, because it's my hand doing math. Or sometimes it's just about the paper getting tired and just that repeating. For me, that—
And the dome collapses.
The dome collapses so easily. Like if it's either really strong or it just like falls apart. For me, that also relates to a lot of Keren's work too, or this idea of, or what you were saying about then are we done? You know, I'm kind of stuck in that in between, the desire for this perfect model and modeling it and understanding it and reverse engineering it, but also the sense of like, I know it can collapse.
But part of the idea here, what I was reacting was basically that you exhibit the paradox, or you exhibit the tension, and the force of the work comes out of precisely the collision of that perfect dimension, and then the coarseness of the folding and the fragility of the folding, and that in itself is already, if you want to put it in a paradoxical position or whatever, you know, but that in itself is what gives the force of the work, you know. That was, but no, it's very good, and I don't know if we are done. You know, Keren will let us know if we are done.
Let us know.
I don't think we're done. I don't think we're done. And that's actually why I'm very interested in this area of object orientation. New materialism is sort of related, but is not exactly what I'm talking about. But, you know, I think a lot about Roland Barthes as sort of the main guy of, you know, death of everything, right? And then in Camera Lucida, he's really grappling with this idea of like, am I a subject? Am I an object? Am I a subject becoming an object? Am I disappearing? What's happening to me? And so I think rather than saying we're done, or even rather than saying the subject is dead, like I'm not an object-oriented ontologist, right? I'm not saying we are objects done. I'm sort of interested in it as a framework to give us language to match the moment, to meet this moment, right? We are in a moment where our subjectivity as modern humans, which we are, is in a way insufficient. It's not enough for us to sort of understand what's happening to us and what's happening with us and what we're doing out in the world, including questions of democracy and freedom and you know, liberation, and like what is the question for me is, you know, if subjectivity in and of itself, like Ariella Azoulay, she says, what if photography was invented in 1492? What if we think about photography as having been invented out of this ideology of, like Yasi was saying, colonialism and imperialism, and sort of the imperial rights of the imperial subject. And photography is sort of, in a lot of ways, is built on that foundation, which is obviously a really problematic foundation that, you know, fortunately we're starting to look at. And so I think, again, the project isn't so much to say like, we're done, we don't exist anymore. It's really about looking back and like, what made us what we are, what made photography what it is, and our relationship to photography. And then, you know, as an educator, and you know, my fellow panelists are also educators, like we see work in our classroom where it's like, what is this? Like, how can we even call this a photograph anymore? And so I think that for us as artists, educators, curators, writers, it's really important to develop a language outside of subjectivity and to actually have an alternative to, well, the subject is just dead, the author is dead. It's like, I feel like I love post-structuralism, but it leaves me sometimes feeling a little bit empty. Like, okay, so what is there, you know? And so I think having these languages and these frameworks to play with are really important for creative practice.
I think that's actually a great place to leave it, because it at least superficially appears somewhat more upbeat. So I think that's a great place for us to hang our hats. just for now. Thanks.
We are done here.
Yeah, we're done. We're done here. But I want to thank Yasi, and I want to thank Keren, and I want to thank Bob for being part of this, and I want to thank all of you for hanging out. So this will be available if you want to. It's recorded. It will be archived, and it will be available. So thanks to everybody, and obviously we'll see many of you later. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Lyle.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Liz.